Part 1. Elizabeth's stagnant life. Have you ever felt like you were stuck on repeat, living the same day over and over, each one blending seamlessly into the next without offering anything to anticipate? That's where I found myself, not in some metaphorical way, but truly stuck in a life that felt like a dull rerun. My name is Linda, I'm 57, and I own a small antique shop in a sleepy town in Maine. Life here moves slowly, too slowly. Every morning I shuffle out of bed, brew a cup of coffee, and lean against the windowsill of my tiny, comfortable house, letting out a sigh as I stare at the same familiar street. That shop used to mean everything to me. I poured my heart into every detail, every item on display. But somewhere along the way it lost its spark. It's just another box to check off in a routine that seems to drag endlessly. 7 years ago I got divorced. My ex-husband, Jim, and I didn't have some fiery, dramatic fallout. It was quieter than that. Still, when he left, it was like a piece of me walked out the door with him. In the early days, I cried until my chest ached, but as time passed, the tears dried up, leaving behind something harder to define. It wasn't sharp or unbearable, just a constant, hollow ache. Then one day, I decided to stop by the local Walmart to pick up a few things for the shop and the house. Walmart's nothing special. It's just where you go when you need odds and ends. I'd been there hundreds of times, but something felt different as I walked in that day. The automatic doors opened and I was hit by the sound of chatter and laughter. Families with kids giggling, couples holding hands, older friends leaning on carts and sharing stories. A strange thought crossed my mind. When did my life stop moving forward? I wandered the aisles aimlessly, my cart rattling across the floor as I glanced at shelves of cereal boxes and discounted knickknacks. My mind was elsewhere, somewhere far from the fluorescent lights and packed shelves. Little did I know that mundane trip to Walmart would change everything. Part 2. A chance encounter. I was still lost in thought, half-heartedly pushing my cart down the aisles, when I finally approached the checkout lanes. That's when I saw him. Standing behind the register was someone I didn't expect. A young man who immediately stood out. His name tag read Ethan, and he had curly, slightly messy hair that looked like he'd just run his hands through it. He was tall, so tall maybe 6 feet 3 inches, and his Walmart vest of all things fit him like it had been tailored. His lean, athletic frame made him look effortlessly put together. But the real showstopper? That smile. It was the kind of smile that lit up his whole face, warm and welcoming, as if he genuinely cared about each person in his line. My heart, which I hadn't felt in years, decided to wake up and do somersaults. I couldn't believe myself. 57 years old and suddenly feeling like a schoolgirl with a crush. When it was my turn, Ethan looked up, his bright green eyes locking with mine, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice smooth and warm, pulling me back to reality. "Oh, yes, sorry." I stammered, my face heating up like I just walked into the sun. I looked down quickly, pretending the loaf of bread in my cart was the most fascinating thing I'd ever seen. Ethan chuckled. A low, soft laugh that somehow made me feel less embarrassed. "No worries. Happens all the time," he said, his tone playful yet kind. I managed to smile, finally meeting his gaze again as he scanned my items. His charm was so effortless, and for the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar. A flutter, a spark, a warmth that melted the layers of monotony I'd been wrapped in. After he rang up my groceries, I did something I almost never did. I left a tip. A $5 bill I placed on the counter with a trembling hand. "Thank you," I said softly, my eyes catching his for a fleeting second. Ethan smiled wider, holding my gaze just a little longer than necessary. "Thank you, ma'am. Have a great day." I left Walmart that evening with a cart full of groceries and a head full of thoughts. The cool breeze brushed against my cheeks as I stepped outside, but it couldn't chase away the warmth blooming inside me. Ethan. His name lingered in my mind like the refrain of a song I couldn't stop humming. I scolded myself silently. "Don't be ridiculous, Linda. He's just a young guy doing his job and you're just you." Still, no amount of logic could erase the tiny shift that had taken place. It was as if the dull routine of my life had cracked open just enough to let in a little light. Part 3. Reasons to return. I told myself it was nothing, Just a silly, fleeting moment of admiration. But as the days went on, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Ethan's smile, his voice, those bright green eyes. They had settled into my mind like an uninvited guest I didn't want to send away. First I brushed it off. But then my pantry, stocked to the brim, suddenly seemed to be missing things. Eggs, milk, bread. Things I didn't really need started making their way onto my shopping list. Each trip to Walmart became a small secret thrill. A little burst of excitement in my otherwise dull existence. I'd stroll through the aisles pretending to browse, my heart pounding every time I caught a glimpse of him behind the register. The anticipation built as I tried to guess which lane he'd be working. And when I finally saw him, my chest tightened in a way I couldn't quite explain. Ethan was always the same, smiling warmly, his posture relaxed, moving with ease as he scanned items. When it was my turn, he greeted me with that same cheerful tone. "Hi, ma'am. Hope you're having a good day." I nodded, suddenly feeling awkward and unsure of myself. "It's been fine, thank you," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. As he scanned my items, I found my gaze drifting to his hands, strong, steady, and practiced. I realized it had been years since I'd noticed such small, intimate details about anyone. Lingering thoughts. When the transaction was complete, I did something I hadn't done in years. I handed Ethan another $5 tip. But this time it wasn't just out of politeness. As I placed the bill on the counter, his eyes met mine again, and for a brief, electric moment, his gaze lingered. My heart fluttered in a way that made me feel both exhilarated and absurd. "Thank you," Ethan said, his warm smile lighting up his face. "You're welcome," I replied, my voice soft as I tried to maintain composure. As I walked back to my car, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Does he remember me? Or am I just another face in the crowd? The rational side of me insisted that I was overthinking it, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the full truth. These trips to Walmart were starting to become more than errands. They were becoming small, glowing moments of anticipation in a life that had been dulled by routine. Seeing Ethan, even briefly, made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. Alive. Part 4. The parking lot encounter. One afternoon, after an unusually slow day at the shop, I found myself closing early. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go to Walmart. This time I didn't bother justifying it with a list of groceries I didn't need. I just wanted to see Ethan. The late afternoon sun painted the town in a golden hue, casting long soft shadows across the parking lot as I pulled in. Something about the moment felt serene, as if the world was pausing just for me. I stepped inside the store, and that familiar mix of excitement and nervousness bubbled up again. Wandering through the aisles, I pretended to browse, my eyes discreetly scanning for him. And then there he was, Ethan, stationed at a register, his hands moving smoothly as he scanned items for a customer. That smile of his made my heart skip again. But this time I didn't rush over. I took my time, picking up things I didn't need. A jar of spaghetti sauce, a roll of paper towels, a bag of coffee. Once I'd killed enough time to avoid looking too obvious, I made my way to his lane. As always, he greeted me with that familiar, easygoing smile. "Hi, ma'am. Hope you're having a good day," he said, his green eyes meeting mine. I managed a small, nervous smile and replied, "It's been fine, thank you." Afterward, as I walked out into the parking lot, I paused beside my car, feeling restless. I couldn't keep doing this. These brief moments, no matter how thrilling, weren't enough. I wanted more. I wanted to know him. An idea, ridiculous and impulsive, popped into my head. Before I could talk myself out of it, I popped the hood of my car and stood there, frowning down at the engine as if something were wrong. A few minutes later, I saw Ethan step out of the store, a grocery bag swinging from his hand. My heart raced as his eyes landed on me, his pace slowing. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" he called out, his voice carrying over the quiet of the parking lot. Startled, I looked up, pretending to be surprised. "Oh, I'm not sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "The car's been acting up all week. I don't think it wants to start." Ethan set his bag down on the curb and walked over. "Want me to take a look? Would you?" "I'd really appreciate it," I replied, stepping aside to give him room. He leaned over the open hood, his hands deftly inspecting the wires and pipes. I watched him work, unable to stop myself from noticing the little details. The way his curls fell across his forehead, the strong, capable way his hands moved. Doesn't seem like anything serious, Ethan said after a moment, straightening up. But I know a good mechanic if you want to get it checked out. Relief washed over me. Relief mixed with a little guilt for my silly ruse. Thank you so much, Ethan. Honestly, I don't know what I'd have done without you. No problem, he said with a warm smile. If you need, I can call that mechanic for you. For a moment I hesitated, my pulse quickening as I prepared to take a bold step. Or, maybe you could give me a ride home? I don't live far, I suggested, trying to keep my tone light. Ethan paused, considering my request, then nodded. Sure. My car's right over there. My chest swelled with a mix of excitement and nerves as I followed him to his car. It wasn't much. A small practical vehicle, but it felt like the start of something bigger. Part 5. A moment of closeness. As Ethan pulled into my driveway, the evening had settled into a calm stillness. My modest home, surrounded by a cozy garden and illuminated by the soft glow of porch lights, felt unusually inviting tonight. When he stepped out of the car and walked me to my front door, I turned to him, still feeling the flutter of nerves in my chest. Would you like to come in for a beer? I asked, my voice steady despite the anticipation coursing through me. Just as a thank you for helping me out. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his gaze meeting mine. A small knowing smile crossed his face, one that made my heart skip yet again. Sure, he said, his voice light and sincere. Who could turn that down? As I unlocked the door and let him inside, the quiet familiarity of my home seemed to shift. It no longer felt like just a house, it felt like the start of something new. Something I wasn't ready to let slip away. A spark in the quiet. As we stepped into the house, the lingering chill of the evening gave way to the cozy warmth of my home. Outside, the faint hum of distant traffic and rustling leaves faded into silence. Inside, everything felt more personal, more intimate. I moved to the kitchen, grabbing 2 cold beers from the fridge. When I handed one to Ethan, our fingers brushed. A fleeting touch, but it sent a quiet thrill coursing through me. We settled on the couch, each finding our place in the comfortable space between us. The soft clink of bottle caps breaking open filled the room before our conversation began with light, easy chatter. We talked about work, daily routines, and the little absurdities of life. Ethan's stories captivated me. He had a way of making even the most mundane tales from his shifts at Walmart sound funny and endearing. His humor was quick but never forced, and his laughter was infectious. I found myself giggling more freely than I had in years, the tension I hadn't realized I was carrying melting away with every word. After a while, curiosity got the better of me. I've always wondered. I began, my voice soft. How do you manage to keep smiling through such long days? Ethan's expression didn't falter, but his eyes softened, holding a glimmer of something I couldn't quite name. It's not too hard, he replied with a small, earnest smile. When you get to meet special customers like you. The words hung in the air, weighty yet light, making my heart skip a beat. His gaze lingered, and for a moment, the space between us felt charged. I quickly looked away, feeling heat rise to my cheeks, but the shy smile tugging at my lips betrayed the nervous delight blooming inside me. As the conversation deepened, the atmosphere shifted. The room seemed to draw closer around us, cocooning us in a shared warmth. I felt my worries, my loneliness, ebb away, replaced by a sense of comfort I hadn't realized I'd been missing. After a pause, I broke the silence, my voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, Ethan, for everything tonight. It means a lot. He tilted his head slightly, his smile softening. Honestly, this has been one of the nicest evenings I've had in a long time, he admitted, his sincerity clear in his tone. His words left my heart fluttering, and though I tried to hide it, the warmth spreading through my chest was undeniable. When Ethan finally stood to leave, the moment felt achingly brief. As he walked to the door and turned back to give me one last smile, something inside me shifted. I stood by the window watching him climb into his car and drive off, the sound of his engine fading into the quiet night. For a long time I just stood there, staring out into the darkness. The house felt different now, Not emptier but fuller, as though his presence had lingered, leaving behind a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. In that stillness I realized something that both thrilled and terrified me. I might have found something I didn't even know I was searching for. Part 6. The Turning Point. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. I couldn't stop replaying the evening, his smile, his laughter, the way he had looked at me as if I were the only person in the world. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in those feelings, doubt crept in. I was older, more set in my ways. What could he possibly see in me? Yet, no matter how hard I tried to push those thoughts away, the memory of his kindness and warmth lingered. The next day, I buried myself in work, scrubbing every inch of the shop until my arms ached. I rearranged shelves, polished antiques, and even tackled long-forgotten corners of the house. But I wasn't just cleaning, I was preparing. I didn't know exactly what for, but the thought of seeing Ethan again made my chest tighten with both anticipation and fear. Late that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, a knock at the door startled me. My heart leapt before I even reached for the handle. When I opened it, there he was standing on the porch with that same easy smile. "Miss Elizabeth," he greeted, his voice warm and steady. "I realized I forgot to give you the mechanic's address last time, so I thought I'd bring it over." His tone was casual, but the underlying warmth in his eyes made my breath catch. "Oh," I managed, stepping aside to let him in. "That's very thoughtful of you." As we settled into conversation once more, I was struck by how natural it felt, as though we'd been friends for years. Ethan wasn't just charming. There was depth to him. He spoke with a thoughtful honesty, sharing dreams of exploring the country, seeing everything life had to offer. His words painted vivid pictures of places I'd only seen in magazines or fleeting daydreams. I found myself drawn to his stories, captivated by the way he spoke of the world as if it were a canvas waiting to be filled. As the room grew dimmer, the glow of the lamp softened, casting a warm light that seemed to wrap us in its embrace. The air between us thickened with something unspoken, something neither of us seemed ready to break. And for the first time in years I felt a spark of hope, not just for what might be, but for what I could still become. I don't know what came over me, but I reached out and let my hand rest gently on Ethan's arm. It was a small gesture, hesitant yet deliberate, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. My heart raced as I searched for the right words, my voice trembling just enough to betray my emotions. "Thank you," I whispered, looking up at him. "You've brought light into my life in ways I didn't expect." For a moment, Ethan's expression shifted. There was surprise in his eyes, but it quickly melted into something softer, something warm and unguarded. He leaned in just slightly, his gaze steady as he placed his hand gently over mine. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and comforting, "you don't need to thank me. If anything, I feel like I've learned more from you than I ever thought possible." His words settled over me, a balm to wounds I hadn't realized were still so raw. In that moment, with his hand covering mine, I felt something I hadn't in years, seen, valued, connected. We weren't strangers anymore, bound only by chance encounters. Something deeper had formed between us, something unspoken yet undeniable. The years separating us, the circumstances that might have seemed insurmountable before, suddenly felt insignificant. A warmth spread through my chest as I smiled, an honest, radiant smile that I hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. It wasn't forced or fleeting. It was filled with hope, a quiet joy that bubbled to the surface effortlessly in Ethan's presence. That night, we talked well into the evening. It wasn't just idle chatter. It was the kind of conversation that left you feeling lighter, as though you'd shed years of loneliness in the span of a few hours. We shared our dreams, our struggles, and even the little things that made us who we were. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was standing at the threshold of something new, something beautiful. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of happiness. It was the start of something far more profound. Part 7. A New Chapter. In the days that followed, life seemed to take on a new hue. The sunlight streaming through the windows of my shop felt warmer, richer, as though the world had shifted ever so slightly. Even the mundane interactions with neighbors carried a new weight, a reminder of the joy found in the simple act of connection. But it was Ethan's presence in my life that truly transformed everything. His visits to the shop became frequent, no longer sporadic or incidental. Each time he walked through the door, it wasn't just to pass time. It was to be with me. We spent our days sharing meals, laughing over old stories, and falling into moments of quiet companionship that felt more intimate than words ever could. Ethan took a genuine interest in my little antique shop, offering fresh ideas to draw in younger customers. He saw potential where I had become blind to it, and with his encouragement I began to see it too. In return, I shared my love for the treasures in the shop, the stories behind each piece, the history they carried, and the timelessness of their beauty. Ethan listened intently, his admiration for my work deepening with every story. He didn't just see antiques, he saw the way they connected the past to the present, and he admired how I brought that connection to life. One evening, after a quiet dinner at my home, the air between us shifted. The flickering candlelight cast warm, dancing shadows across the room, wrapping us in an intimacy that was both comforting and exhilarating. Ethan was quieter than usual, his gaze lingering on me with a tenderness I hadn't seen before. There was something in his eyes, a depth of emotion that made my heart race. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice steady but laced with feeling. "I've never met anyone who makes me feel so completely at peace, and yet so alive at the same time." His words settled over me like a blanket, warming me in a way that reached far beyond the surface. I didn't respond right away, I couldn't. My heart was too full, my emotions too raw. Instead, I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or uncertain. It was filled with understanding, a shared acknowledgement of everything we had come to mean to one another. In that moment, I realized just how much my life had changed since the day Ethan first walked into it. The loneliness I had carried for so long no longer felt insurmountable. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, and I knew deep in my heart that this was only the beginning. Elizabeth's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat as a deep, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. She felt her cheeks flush, not from embarrassment, but from a surge of anticipation. A spark that had lain dormant for years, now ignited by the man sitting across from her. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice heavy with emotion, her gaze locking onto his with a force that almost startled her. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Ethan's green eyes softened, and in that moment, the space between them seemed to dissolve. Slowly he reached out, taking her hand in his. The warmth of his touch was grounding, yet electric, as though the universe itself had conspired to bring them together. Without breaking his gaze, Ethan leaned in. His movements were unhurried, his intent clear but gentle. And then, before Elizabeth could utter another word, his lips met hers. The kiss was everything and nothing like she expected. Soft but urgent, tender yet filled with a longing that resonated deep within her. Time seemed to pause, the world outside fading until it was just them, their hearts beating in unison. Elizabeth felt the strength of his hand resting on the small of her back, steadying her, grounding her as if to say, "You're safe here. You're wanted." The last remnants of doubt she'd clung to melted away as she surrendered to the moment, allowing herself to be swept up in a connection that felt as natural as breathing. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan's hand lingered on hers, his voice low and thick with emotion. "Elizabeth," he murmured, his eyes searching hers. "I don't want to rush anything. I want this to be right for both of us." A smile tugged at her lips, soft and full of quiet confidence. She raised her hand to his cheek, her thumb brushing lightly against his skin. "Ethan," she said, her voice steady and sure, "I've waited a long time for this. For you. I'm ready." What followed was a shared intimacy neither of them had fully expected but both had longed for. The air between them seemed charged, filled with unspoken words and years of suppressed emotion finally finding their release. Every touch, every glance, every whisper spoke volumes, of trust, of desire, of a connection that went far deeper than either of them had dared to hope for. That night, Elizabeth didn't just feel loved, she felt alive. Truly deeply alive. It was as if the pieces of her life, fractured and scattered for so long, had finally come together in Ethan's arms. The void she hadn't even known existed were filled with a passion and hope she hadn't thought herself capable of feeling again. When morning came, sunlight spilled through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. Elizabeth stirred, the warmth of the light waking her gently. She turned her head and saw Ethan beside her, his face calm, his breathing even. He looked peaceful, content, as if he too had found something he didn't realize he was missing. A profound sense of peace washed over her as she watched him sleep. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elizabeth felt whole. She wasn't alone anymore. The quiet rhythm of Ethan's breath was enough to remind her that he was where she was meant to be. But this wasn't the end of Elizabeth's story. No, this was only the beginning. Together, she and Ethan would write a new chapter. One filled with love, trust, and the kind of connection that only comes when two people choose to open their hearts completely. Their future stretched before them, rich with possibility and alive with the promise of days yet to come. It wouldn't always be easy, but it would always be worth it because they had each other. And for Elizabeth, that was more than enough. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. We hope it resonated with you, touched your heart, or simply brought a moment of joy to your day. If you haven't already, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support may seem like a small gesture, but it means the world to us. It fuels our passion to continue creating stories that matter. And if this story spoke to you, don't forget to give it a like or share your thoughts in the comments. Every interaction helps us grow and continue building this incredible community. Thank you for being a part of our journey. Here's to more stories, more connections, and more moments that remind us what it means to truly live.